Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Dude, this is the show that everybody's been waiting to see. Alonso, Hamilton, and Verstappen, the top three drivers, all three world champions fighting at the top. Dude, this is awesome to watch.
How many combined World Drivers' Championships are we talking about here? 11?
11, because they got two for Verstappen and Alonso, and then two for Verstappen, two for Alonso, and then 7 from Hamilton.
11 championships fighting 1 through 3 in Canada, of all places.
I know. It's just cool to see how Mercedes is now able to not only keep pace with that Aston, but it's a full-on fight. And then, I don't know if you were paying attention, but did you see how close they were to this Red Bull the entire race?
Yeah, so Max, as everybody's familiar with, is ending races 20 to 40 seconds up, and sometimes he'll sneak in a cheap little pit stop and he'll finish, 10 seconds up or whatever. This race, it was more of a 9-second lead, but it was much closer until like the very, very end. We were talking like 2 to 4 second gap the entire race, 1 through 3.
Yeah, and the only reason that gap of 9 seconds even arrived is because we saw at the end how Alonso was being told to lift off the throttle and coast. He had some kind of problem going on. We'll talk about that later on when it pops up. But the whole fact of the matter is that had that not happened, and with Hamilton keeping pace with Alonso, I really think that this could have been a battle for first. I don't know for sure that I can say Verstappen would have won.
We heard it around lap 40 or 50 or so. Alonso came on talking to his engineers, and he said, "I want to win the race, mate." And he was only down 3 or 4 seconds at that point. It was very realistic that if Verstappen had a slight mistake or slight error or did like almost slapped a wall like he did, Alonso would have been
almost
right there.
Knock himself out.
I'll say I'm only disappointed that in a race that has a section known as the Wall of Champions, we didn't have a single champion slap that wall.
They were all too busy. Walls.
They were all too busy slapping the wall at turn 6.
Yeah.
As we get into a little bit of the quality and race day, I love the Canada track. I think it's a great track. I love the atmosphere around it. I've talked about it a million times on our podcast, how I love the atmosphere of race day. You have this island where the course surrounds the island. You have water on all sides of the track. They do a great job with helicopter or drone shots showing that as the cars are going around. Meanwhile, you're surrounded on this island, and then as the cars are going through these turns, it looks like they're in the middle of a forest. It's a very cool atmosphere that they've got going on in Montreal.
Yeah, definitely a fan of the Canadian Grand Prix. I like the overall aspect of it's like when you're looking at the background, the backdrop behind the track and everything, it's gorgeous, man. It's absolutely gorgeous. I really think it's cool. If you're just tuning in, this is the Turn 1 podcast, or Turn 1 a Formula One podcast. This is the Canadian race recap with your host, Jeremiah.
And Thomas.
Thomas, what were some of your thoughts about the actual racing itself before we dive into the whole racing lap by lap and everything else?
This was just a good Formula One race. We had a little bit of everything, but nothing was too much. Nothing was overkill. You had quality position battles 1 through 20 down, looking down the grid. You had solid overtakes. You had DRS advantages. You only had one safety car, one virtual safety car, I believe. I do like when races have safety cars. I think that throws the teams a strategical curveball, if you will. But I don't like it when we have 5 safety cars in a race and it drags on and drags on and drags on. I'm also not a huge fan of races that just run clean the whole time, because to me that means guys aren't taking as many chances as they probably could. We saw that early on in the year, like I think Bahrain, people were running safe. But overall, a really good race. And ultimately, like Jeremiah brought us in with, you had 3 champions duking it out for the podium, essentially.
Yeah. So like we talked about earlier, we talked about the beginning of the grid, or the front of the grid rather, but I want to kind of do a little couple shout outs to the middle of the grid in the back. Um, I understand that McLaren still hasn't necessarily figured it out. They're not dominating or even kind of coming close to the term. But Piastri's starting to figure that car out, man. And him and Norris are starting to get really similar in times. Norris obviously still being noticeably better, but Piastri not that far behind.
You know what I noticed from Oscar in this race? The dude was aggressive.
Yes.
Super aggressive.
Yes.
He was fighting anybody in front of him or behind him, including his own teammate, for a good part of the race. He was dive bombing corners. He was going outside at the hairpin. He was going inside at the hairpin. He was running right up on people as they were going into braking zones. That's what you need to see from a young guy trying to enter the sport. This is what we've been talking about, like wanting to see out of like Zhou Guan Yu and Yuki Tsunoda. They have like little flashes of this, but you need to see that every single race, that you're trying to get 10th place, you're trying to get 9th place, you're trying to get points for your team. That's huge.
Speaking of trying to get points for your team, Alex Albon had a great defensive drive today, or not today, but on Sunday.
We've talked about him so many times this year alone about how the Williams has pace. At least he has pace in the Williams.
Right.
Some others don't. But there's always something that gets in his way, right? He crashes. He has somebody box him out. He has a strategical error. But I think we saw in Canada, it finally kind of paid off. He ended up getting a points finish, and he could have that Williams in the top 10 every single race if things work out the way that they should.
Dude, in that battle at the very end where they had about 4 people coming after him, and he didn't have DRS, but he had this massive DRS train behind him, and he was keeping it at bay the entire time. I was like, ah!
Is it just me, or is the Alpine team just completely unnoticeable this year?
It's not that they're unnoticeable, it's that they're not doing anything spectacular. They're getting great finishes, but it's not consistent. It's off and on.
Like, I remember when Esteban Ocon was like a constant 4, 5, 6 finisher, and I just don't feel like we're getting that this year. And I guess that's because Aston Martin joined the party.
Or it's because Alonso left the party.
Oh, yeah, in the Alpine. But yeah, I'm specifically talking Ocon. He was in that battle. The reason I brought him up, he was in that battle at the end trying to catch Alex Albon, which is
really
well,
that's what I'm
for
saying.
An Alpine.
I felt like whenever he was driving with Fernando, he was picking up tips, and he almost had this chip on his shoulder to be better than Fernando because there was a rivalry there between the two. So I always had this impression that when Fernando was in that seat, he was giving it everything he's got, versus now it's Gasly, and Gasly's not necessarily meeting the pace, and he definitely doesn't have the pace that Fernando had. So Esteban's kind of coasting. I hate to say that.
You mind if we go ahead and get into qualifying here a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was raining, right? We know that. They mentioned this on the broadcast as well, that I guess for whatever reason, the Canada weekend, they don't run a lot of events before the Formula One race, whereas other weekends they have like several Formula Feeder Series races, other supercar races, and it lays down a lot of rubber on the track. But they said the combination of the rain and the less races caused the track to be pretty green whenever they were out there running the race. But you go into qualifying, I'm just going to call out some surprises maybe. I don't think Q1 was any surprise. You had Yuki, Nick DeVries, Logan Sargent, Zhou Guan Yu get knocked out, along with Pierre Gasly, which I guess is partially a surprise, although
somebody got in his way on that final heater lap, but regardless, he couldn't get it done.
You've got to lay down a solid lap early. We've seen that. We've seen Sergio Perez do that a number of times in races where his first lap is just an okay lap, and that ends up getting pole, right? Q2, this is where you had some heavy hitters get knocked out. Charles Leclerc, Sergio Perez, Lance Stroll. We brought this up, I think, the past 2 weeks. He's got to be getting top 10 qualies and finishes. We're not seeing that yet. And then looking at the top 10, you had some surprises into the mix. Alex Albon, who we just referenced, Oscar Piastri, and both McLarens actually in the top 10 for probably the first time this season, both qualifying in the top 10.
I can't recall. They've been so unnoticeable.
And then who's the belle of the ball of qualifying?
Nico Hülkenberg,
who ultimately takes second. Now he does get a little penalty, and he's got to drop down on race day. But Haas is showing improvement. I still question why they have drivers in their 30s doing it, but hey, maybe this is the dream team.
So here's my problem with Haas. They've been doing great in qualifying. Absolutely phenomenal. They've been getting into Q3 way more often than they should be for the kind of car that they have. All of this focus on qualifying is great and for that one lap pace, but we need to see race results. It's not looking pretty. It hasn't been pretty all season. They always start out pretty well off, but then they don't really advance much. They kind of fall back. I'd like to see more emphasis placed on the actual race pace itself.
Jumping ahead a little bit, I made a note on lap 20 of the race that Haas and Magnussen specifically have an unlucky streak when they get in the top 10.
Yeah.
Just think back the past couple seasons with Haas this year where you had Nico, in the past couple years where you have K-Mag. They have an outstanding qualifying, and you're like, Haas is here. Welcome to the party. And then race day happens, and they fall back to where they kind of normally fit.
I know. I want to see them pull off an Albon and just kind of hang out in seventh for the entire race.
They can't hold position, and then once they start losing positions, they struggle to gain them back, and we've seen this from the past couple of seasons.
Okay, is that all that you had for qualifying?
That is it.
All right, so we see Verstappen taking pole, obviously. Again, nothing stopping that. Nico taking second, but then dropping back down to fifth. And then the back next to Alonso and Hamilton, followed by Russell in that fourth spot.
And I missed a note that, so I said Lance Stroll had gotten out in Q2, but he also took a penalty and was moved down to 16th starting on the grid. And Carlos Sainz, who finished in Q1, took a penalty and dropped down to 11th on race day.
I noticed I don't know if it was all of the penalties, but I noticed there was a lot of impeding for this entire qualifying session. There was a lot of impeding. And I don't know if that's just because the track might be narrow or, I don't really know. It felt like everybody kept getting in their way.
It seems like the Canada track just brings out something weird in these teams, because we saw it on race day with like 12 different instances of being noted for unsafe releases. Like something is off with that track that throws teams for a loop, and I don't really know what it is.
I agree. Okay. Are you ready to dive into a turn one?
Let's get it.
So Verstappen gets a bomb start off the line. This is something we talked about in the past that he hasn't really been able to get, but he does in this race, takes off, and they're not able to catch him. Alonso, I don't think he has like the worst start, but it felt like Hamilton just had a bomb start. He got off that line as quick as possible, overtakes Alonso for second. Russell tries to take a look at Alonso as well, but kind of bails out because that's not going to happen. Ocon gets a great start, and Hulkenberg kind of drops back. Piastri goes to the inside of Lando on turn one, which makes him on the outside in turn two, but he still makes it work. So he was on the inside or outside of turn one and then on the inside of turn two. I thought that was crazy. And I noticed a trend here because this is the next couple drivers follow the same trend. Leclerc was on the inside of Albon. Perez was on the inside of Sainz. It seems like going into turn one and as you approach turn two, if you're on the outside for turn one, putting you on the inside for turn two, you're going to get a place advance. I don't know what that's about. I guess it's just a bad exit.
I think turn one is a faster turn, and turn two, they have to way slow down. So if you have the inside lane on that longer turn, you're more advantaged, maybe.
I guess you can just get on the gas because you straighten out faster because you're doing a more direct turning radius instead of that wide arc. Regardless, though, I did see something pretty cool. Magnussen dive bombs on Sainz, gets past him, and goes to the outside. Now, Sainz obviously gets that back, but look at Magnussen getting a little bold. Love to see
they have to take those chances early for the Haas team. Like, you've got to get as many positions as soon as possible because during the race your car is just going to slowly fall back down.
So I did say that if you're on the outside of turn one and then therefore inside of turn two, then you typically will get the place. That's not what we saw from Lance Stroll. Gasly gets a great start and passes Bottas, but then they kind of get bunched up on that outside of turn one, like I was talking about. Lance dive bombs on turn one, takes the outside on turn two, but he gets on the throttle quick and keeps that position, taking 2 places off the jump.
I watched a lot. I watched only the first, I think, 5 cars during the start of the race. And then I look for those replays that they go back to when they show the middle of the pack and the back of the field. And that's usually where the action is, like in that 10 to 15 spot, because those guys are trying to get in points position so fast. And that includes Lance Stroll. When you quali 11 and then you're moved down to 16th and you're in a top 2 or 3 constructor, you've got to be forcing your way up the pack early.
Yeah, especially with how everybody being close up to each other. You're not going to get that opportunity later on. You're going to have to fight for those positions, and you're going to have to get it lap by lap instead of just right there. Everybody's bunched up. Maybe I can take over 2 or 3 guys.
And his car is faster than most of the cars
Oh
around him.
yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely.
At the time, I guess he was kind of near a Ferrari and maybe near George Russell.
Well, I was thinking more of the Alpine of Gasly, just because Gasly did have a great jump, and I think that the Alpine did have a better start off that line than the Aston Martin. But it's like I said, Gasly makes a weird call and kind of goes into the traffic, causing him to slow way down and giving Lance Stroll that inside corner. So, I mean, that's his move. That's a driver error in my eyes.
I'll say real quick, I think it's apparent now, ever since Mercedes rolled up their big upgrade package, that the Mercedes car and the Aston Martin car are neck and neck in overall performance. Obviously, they probably excel at one thing better than the other does and vice versa. But you saw Hamilton get that fantastic jump on Alonso, but you also saw where George Russell couldn't quite catch Alonso, and then Alonso and Hamilton kind of pull away. And then obviously we follow the fight for Hamilton and Alonso throughout the race. But those 3 cars were so close the entire day.
We'll
just
see,
minus George's incident.
That's where I see that it comes down to the driver. And this is where I kind of tried to make that impression on George not being as good as I think sometimes we like to give him credit for, because at the end of the day, he's going to be better than a lot of the other guys his age and maybe guys older than him. But when he's going up against the best of the best, he's not there yet. I mean, he wasn't able to keep pace with Alonso or make Alonso look foolish by having that bad start. He didn't take advantage of that whatsoever. He hung back, and then Alonso and Hamilton took off, leaving George. Now, I don't know where George's pace went, because in the past seasons and in earlier, I feel like in this season, we saw great pace from George, and him and Hamilton were kind of going neck and neck. But it feels like in these last, I want to say 3-4 races, it felt like George has just not had the pace of even his teammate Hamilton.
It's that upgrade package. I think he was starting to figure out that old car, and that's why we saw pace out of him. And ever since they've rolled out the new car, he hasn't pieced it together like he did with the old car. Now, granted, he's faster in this new car than he was in the old car, but compared to his teammate or the Aston Martins, he's not there yet.
Well, sure, it adds downforce, and whenever you're adding downforce to a car that you've already essentially figured out, now you can take turns differently, and now you got to figure everything else out to find the limit again. So I get it.
Okay, is that all we have for the first turn 1 and turn 2? Because they're kind of bunched up, I guess.
Yeah, the rest of the pack is just DeVries, Sargent, Sonoda, and Zhou, and they didn't really do nothing. Nothing changed there.
Okay, so as we circle around turn 1, there's only a couple of really big overtaking spots in Canada. We forgot to mention that it's 70 laps, which sounds like a lot, but again, it's a pretty short track. It has almost no elevation. It's pretty flat because it's on an island. But anytime we're talking about overtaking, it's going to be either turn 1 and 2, which Jeremiah just went through, because that's right after the DRS straight, turn 6 and 7, where we saw drivers having issues slapping a wall, and then turn 10, which is the big hairpin, kind of at the apex of the track, if you will, the final, you're going to come back towards the pit after that turn.
Right. And then that final, I'm sorry, I was just going to add that final turn is that massive straight that leads back to the Wall of Champions. So in that straightaway, that's typically in that DRS, you're going to get that advantage. So we see a lot of passing there.
A ton. And it's pretty fast coming into it too, because they have that quick chicane right before the Wall of Champions. And so it's really, really fast into kind of a quick chicane and then back to full speed again out of that, which I think is another DRS zone, right? Going over the start finish line is also DRS.
Yes. So, but the thing is that braking zone right there going into the Wall of the Champions, dude, the amount of people that we saw just sliding right through that as the brakes locked up, or when it was raining in practice and in qualifying, it's just, wow.
That's why they're all slapping that turn, that wall. Okay, so as we get to the end of lap 1, not too much came around while they were running that lap. It all kind of held steady after the first set of turns. Sainz does get his place back from Perez, who Perez took earlier, which was interesting to see some pace out of the Ferrari. We do see Perez and Sainz going after it on that first DRS straight, coming towards the final chicane. Their swerving causes poor Mr. K-Mag to get sent down the runoff area right before the pit entry. He hits a wall. He does get back on track. That could have been catastrophic, could have taken him out of the race. He was very lucky to still be driving after that.
Yeah, I did notice that Magnussen kind of got caught up in that. So Perez was on the inside and kind of just zipped out to the outside at the last second there. And Perez got way harder on the brakes because of signs in front of him than I think K-Mag was ready for. So he just locked up, sent it to the grass, taps that wall, and goes flying towards the pits.
Yep. I thought Verstappen was going to have another 40-second win because on lap 2, he was already 1.1 ahead of Hamilton. And I was like, okay, well, he's going to get a second or two a lap and this is going to be over. That wasn't the case. McLarens were holding 7 and 8 at that point. I was like, hey, McLaren, we're going to get some points. Nope. And Leclerc had made his way up to 9th at that point, just kind of seeing how the Ferraris were going. Here's a note that I made on the craziness of F1 timing. In one turn, so Hamilton was right at 1.0 to 1.1 to Verstappen. And in one turn, he drops down to 1.5 and then it stays at 1.5. He probably missed a turn by a millimeter of where he was supposed to be on the track, or probably didn't throttle up a millisecond faster than you want to. And that gives you a half a second disadvantage to the guy in front of you.
Dude, that's what I was talking about. We talked a little bit about the race kind of before we started filming, but the amount of perfection between these three drivers, I can't remember which driver it was in the post-race interviews, but it was either post-race or post-qualifying. But one of the drivers, it was either Fernando Alonso or Lewis Hamilton, made note that when you're going against these two guys, there's no typically you're looking for mistakes and you capitalize on those moments, but there's no mistakes between them. All you're doing is if you're pushing with everything you have, you might be gaining like 0.2 a lap, and you kind of whittle your way down all the way to them and then look for an opening if there is one. But the amount of perfection as these three guys go around the track is insane.
And 1.0 seconds to 1.5 seconds in Formula One is a huge deal because now you are nowhere near DRS range. You've got to make up a half a second that you just lost. This is also the lap 4 where Alonso slides in turn 6 and slaps the wall.
Little sparks flying.
And I love in the post race when they're showing the three guys that were on the podium in the little holding room. Mm-hmm. And Max says, "Did you hit the wall?" and Alonso's like, "Yeah, a little bit."
Hey, that's called the cooldown room, you uncultured swine.
Whatever. It's not that hot in Canada. All right. I was still taking notes. Max Verstappen took the fastest lap in lap 5. Who cares? They traded all day. Alonso was battling a lot of the time trying to catch Hamilton. We saw a lot of them going right at it in lap 6. And when I say going right at it, like running up on each other in braking zones. And then lap 7, you have something critical in the race. Logan Sargent stops around turn 6, I believe. They came on and they said something I haven't heard before, that his car was reporting a critical error.
Yeah, a critical message, whatever that means.
Yeah, critical message. And they said to stop. So he stopped.
You're done.
Is that like the old Mission Impossible, like this cell phone will self-destruct in 7 seconds? Or
Get out of the car now. No, I did make this note. It was very evident to me. We talked about this already with Russell not being able to keep pace, but it felt like, you know how typically if you get passed by somebody, immediately you're looking over your shoulder at the car behind you. And then for the next few laps, you're doing nothing but managing and kind of trying to defend the car behind you from overtaking you. It felt like I felt none of that from Fernando Alonso. It felt like the second Lewis passed him, he didn't even care about George Russell. George Russell didn't exist. It was just him and Lewis Hamilton and him getting that spot back.
He knew that they would pull away somehow, or I guess he was just confident that they would pull away. And I mean, it paid off.
It worked.
and again, maybe he could have passed him at any second, but maybe he was slightly managing tires, right? Or slightly managing fuel. And he was just running up on him to keep within DRS zone or whatever. But it was a really good battle between those two. I mentioned Logan Sargent pulling over. No safety car there. We got the virtual safety car, which was nice. And then you move on to lap 9 because they cleared that up pretty quickly. Leclerc in lap 9 is told to coast because he is overheating his brakes, which seemed bad early for Ferrari because he was only in ninth at that point and being told to coast in ninth. Lap 12, George Russell slams into a wall. His entire back right tire assembly looks loose. It turns out that it was fixable. It was a long pit stop, obviously, but he breaks his back right tire. His right part of his wing broke off, so they had to replace the wing. He slid over a curb. It seems like those curbs in Canada are just super slick. Slid over that, slammed in the wall, and I am very surprised that car held together because he hit it hard.
I did have a note for lap 11, just one back from you. Everybody was stuck behind Hulkenberg. This made me very upset. Nico is in 7th, and he just has quite literally positions 8 through 16 all stuck directly behind him within a second of each other, within half a second of each other, right on each other. Meanwhile, Piastri, who just got past him, was at this point 2.5 seconds ahead of him.
You'll hear oftentimes when they're doing the grid, like driver pictures before the race starts, they'll say, oh, Sergio Perez in 11th and Carlos Sainz in 10th. They're out of position here, right? And if you're watching your first race, you're like, what do you mean out of position? That's where they qualified. It means that the pace of their car is significantly higher than where they qualified. And over the course of a 70-lap race, things even themselves out and things typically go back to normal. Hulkenberg, being in the top 5 or 6, whatever he was, is also out of place, but in the other direction. He is high up, whereas all the cars behind him are faster.
Oh, and Max hit a bird. So there's some fun for you. Don't know if you caught that message.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah, he comes on the radio and he's like, I think I just hit a bird. I was like, what?
Okay, so we get a full safety car now with George Russell slamming into the wall, and George Russell does limp back to the pits and make it. Pretty much everybody sneaks in a nice little pit stop on this. There are a few exceptions, mainly the Ferraris. I will come back to that later. But when Hamilton is coming out of the pits, he almost smacks right into the side of the charging Alonso up the pit lane. It is noted, but nothing comes of it. That was one of, again, maybe a dozen noted for pit stop releases.
Yeah, I had a note here because I wanted to make a point. So when Alonso is talking to his engineer, the engineer comes on and goes, "It looked pretty dangerous to me." This is a tactic that they purposely use on multiple occasions throughout the races. So for those of you that aren't aware, the FIA and the people governing kind of like to make who the penalties, who gets them and whatnot, they listen to all of these feeds between the drivers and their engineers. So when the engineers are talking to the driver, sometimes they will word things in a specific way so that the FIA will hear it. And I don't want to say manipulate them, but kind of persuade them to kind of see their side. So they'll say something like, "It looked pretty dangerous to me," so that the FIA would be like, "Oh, you know what? That was pretty dangerous. Let's give him a penalty."
Kind of like towards the end of the race when you saw whoever it was calling out Esteban Ocon's wing. Boy, that looks really loose. That could be dangerous if that flies off and hits
Lando
somebody.
Norris.
Yeah. Like, man.
Same principle.
They're throwing out little traps, little landmines, trying to get people busted for stuff. So we get this safety car. The safety car lasted like 5 laps. It was a really long safety car because there was so much debris on the track. We make the note, obviously, that Ferrari doesn't pit. So Ferrari moves up to 4 and 5. That is key because at the start of this race, it was talked about this was likely going to be a 1 or 2 stop strategy. Most teams were going to try to want a run stop. They were going to go from mediums to hards or hards to mediums. And so the safety car kind of throws a wrench in that, where you have a lot of teams now running that 2 stop. Lap 17, the race resumes. All the cars are stacked up as we're used to seeing. Everybody is on hard tires except for the Ferraris, who are on the mediums. And I loved this line by the commentators. I can't remember if it was Crofty or Brundle that said it. And Verstappen, restarts the race and scampers off into the distance.
About those restarts, though, I don't know if you caught this. So Max was out in front doing the whole left and right, warming up those brand new fresh hards. But if you looked behind him, Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton were completely still, focused, and watching his tires the entire time. just
I think
waiting for him to
that's
punch
the
it.
advantage. That's the advantage of being in the lead, is that the leader gets to control when the restart happens. So whenever he goes full speed, you get to go full speed, and you can't pass until you get to the checkered line, right? So Max at that point is saying, all right, cool, I'll warm up my tires. And right when he got to that apex of that last chicane turn, boom, full speed and took off.
I don't know if it's a lack of experience. This made him look kind of bad, but I couldn't help but notice. I was just looking at the top five. Verstappen wiggling his way around, warming up his tires. Hamilton locked on. Alonso locked on. Carlos Sainz in fifth, locked on. What's Charles Leclerc doing in fourth? He's warming up his tires too, because why not?
That, you know, and to the credit of the driver, that might have been a team instruction. Hey, your tires are cold. Or he was the only one on the original tires at that point, the original medium. So maybe they're saying, we need you to pump as much heat into those as you possibly can.
Yeah, it was just odd to me because Sainz was behind him. Neither one of them had pit, and Sainz is sitting here dead center. Just I'm not letting it happen. I'm not getting caught napping.
We saw it with Kimi
Charles over here.
Räikkönen. We saw it with Kimi Räikkönen back in the day. He never warmed his tires. Maybe that's just a driver preference thing.
Well, that was the Iceman. He's a savage.
Okay, so like I said, Verstappen scampers off in the distance because he did get a pretty good lead off that jump. And again, that's the advantage of leading a restart. Russell's now in the back of the race in 19th ever since Logan Sargent had retired. So he's now got to work his way up. I'll go faster through these next laps, but there is some action. Let's see. Lap 18, Norris gets the pass on Oscar Piastri. Piastri does not give it up easily and continues to fight back for that position. He finally loses out as they're approaching the end of the lap. And this is where we start to see about 12 different notes for unsafe release from the safety car stop fly in. Again, referring back to what we started the podcast with, I don't know what goes on in Canada, but something throws those guys off with impeding or unsafe releases or unsportsmanlike behavior. It was a penalty fest. Lap 20, I noted that Oscar Piastri was again super aggressive, but in this point, it actually lost him a spot. He was battling Lando, I still want to say at that time, but then someone came through them, and I think it was a Haas car, or was it Valtteri Bottas? It was some white car in red.
I didn't make note of that.
So his aggression got the better of him, and he lost out on a spot. Lap 22, this is where I note the kind of standings of the race. And then as we approach the end of the lap, there's a note here. So the standings in lap 22 are Verstappen, Hamilton, Alonso, Leclerc, Sainz, and Perez. Okay, your typical bunch. And then Alonso gets the pass on Hamilton for second at the final chicane coming around into lap 23.
Sweet move, too. Ooh!
Again, he might have been able to do that earlier on. Obviously, the safety car put a delay on things, so maybe that could have been 5 or 6 laps earlier. But it's not like he pulled away. It's not like he got a 20-second lead. They were about to fight for the next 50 laps.
Yep.
Okay. Lap 23, I note that Hamilton is just stuck to the back of Alonso fighting for second. He didn't give Hamilton more than like 0.2 or 0.3 seconds of lead. The announcers noted that their combined age was 79 years old.
Jesus.
That one hurts. And then this is also where Carlos Sainz comes on the radio and says that he believes he has pace, subtly hinting that he should pass Charles Leclerc, who is currently ahead of him. The team then clarifies that they have him and Charles running different strategy, which I disagree with because they seem to both be running the same exact strategy. But they were telling Charles to lift and coast and maintain tires because at this point, with Ferrari not pitting during that safety car, they have to do a one-stop. No question about it. Lap 25, this was the first citation for Lando Norris, unless he was cited for unsafe release. Driving unnecessarily slow at the hairpin. Found that odd.
Yeah, so they were trying to do a double stack, so they were trying to make sure that everything was lined up perfectly so nobody got messed with. And he ended up impeding half the race, so
yeah. Lando didn't have a great day from the penalty standpoint.
No.
We've talked Ferrari a couple times. I'll kind of clarify why it matters that they're running a one stop. So at the point of the race that we're in, which is like the mid 20s lap wise, if Ferrari was to pit, which is when their regularly scheduled pit stop would be on their original strategy, they would come back out in the race in like 12th through 15th, just kind of depending. That's a lot of ground to make up on teams that might not pit again, because every team had gone to the hards and there was a chance the hards could have made it to the end. Like there was a chance. They didn't know how they were going to hold up yet. It was too early. So by doing that, they would have to make up a ton of spots. By staying out, they run the risk of losing grip, losing spots that way. Basically, they have to hold fourth, fifth, whatever they're in, until they can get to a mid-race pit stop break and other teams start pitting around them. So it was a key strategy decision by them that we actually saw pay off. Or lap 28, this is when they tell Carlos Sainz to pit, and he says, no. Love Carlos Sainz so much.
That's the thing, though, is that here again, another example of Ferrari trying to ruin things. But again, the difference between Charles and Carlos is that Carlos, no, I'm absolutely not going to pit.
Yep, they said they said dial to red, which is like changing strategy on his wheel, and then they said, box, into this lap or into the next lap, whatever it was, and he's like, no, I'm happy with the strategy we're running, and I'm not going to box now. So later, and they just moved on, and he didn't, and that was a very good decision in the end because they ended up holding those spots. This is why I love Max Verstappen, among other things, but Max Verstappen in lap 31, and he's done this in the past 2 races. Verstappen comes on and says, guys, I'm losing grip on these hards. This is insane. What are we doing? 2 laps later, we're good. Tires are good.
It was weird. That's a weird moment, though, because I felt like there was I don't know if you caught this, but there was probably 3 or 4 times that Max came on to complain about the tires, and his engineer started to get frustrated with him. It got to the point to where he was like, yeah, we got it, Max. Go ahead and put your head down and keep moving.
I think his team knew that he needed to run longer, and I think they know that he's really good at getting rid of the graining on tires because, again, we've seen him do it. So he runs 2 laps trying to get these tires back up to speed, and sure enough, he does it. I have lap 34 bolded and underlined. This was fun. There's a battle for 12th between Nick de Vries and Kevin Magnussen. They are wheel to wheel going into turns 1 and 2. They are bumping. They're playing bumper cars out there. Nothing significant, though. We had a classic through goes Hamilton moment, except this time it's George Russell.
Yeah.
The other Mercedes.
So I wanted to add to this real quick before you keep going, because it actually gets deeper than that. Because you have Nick de Vries in the AlphaTauri or Red Bull, and then you have Kevin Magnussen in the Haas or Ferrari, which is exactly the through goes Hamilton moment played down with the 2 lower end teams.
And worked out exactly the same car wise too, like the Mercedes going through.
Yeah.
So the Russell gets on, and it's a good thing that he got ahead of this train wreck that was about to happen, because as soon as they're coming around to turn 5 or 6, I believe turn 5, De Vries locks up on the inside line of that turn. Kevin Magnussen there then cannot turn to the right because De Vries is inside of him locked up. So Kevin Magnussen also locks up and then goes into the back left of De Vries. And boy, it is so good that there's a runoff area there, because otherwise they would have both slammed into a barrier.
Yeah, but then it took them 7 business days to get out of that runoff area.
Okay. Let me take you. I'm going to fly you to Montreal. I'll pay for you to go there. I'm going to put you in a Haas on the side of that road and say, hey, Jeremiah, I want you to back up onto this track that has cars going 180 miles an hour around it, and let's see how quick you do it.
Well, that depends. Have I been racing with these cars for 7 years, or am I me as I am? Because
no, you're you.
Because Kevin Magnussen has been racing for years in those cars.
You still don't back up at full speed onto a track with.
No, not back up full speed, but it took him 5 business days to find reverse.
Yeah, it did take a while. So there's a yellow flag here. Ferrari, I think at this point was really hoping for a safety car because that would get Ferrari out of their tire management struggle that was going on. There wasn't. This was like the most conservative I've ever seen the FIA with not throwing out a safety car because there's 2 cars stopped on track. Okay. Lap 38, I made the note that the one stop is now not looking feasible for those cars that pit early on the safety car because the hards are starting to deteriorate a little bit faster than everybody thought. And this is also where we see Lando Norris be given an official penalty for unsportsmanlike behavior.
Whatever.
McLaren just can't figure it out.
The problem, I don't know what the problem is, man, but they have two really good drivers. I understand that the car is bad, but it's more than that. I mean, who sent him out of the pits like that? Who half of it's decision based as well. It's almost like not only are they not producing a good car, but it's almost like they took a note straight out of Ferrari's book on how to be a horrible strategist.
Yeah, it's not the drivers necessarily. They're part of the problem, but it is what we saw with Ferrari last year. It's just a team that can't figure it out.
I don't get it. There's so much. They have so much money.
Lap 40, a couple pit stops have happened in between this. Leclerc's pit, Hamilton is pit. Lap 40, I make the note. In lap 41, I make the note on Alonso. Hamilton pits and stays in third. Alonso pits and stays in second. That means that they had built up enough time at the front of the pack to get a cheap pit stop. As soon as Alonso goes to pit, that then triggers Verstappen, who's now on the other side of the track, to also pit because now he's got a free pit stop that those other two guys have gone for. And we still see Alonso, Hamilton, and Verstappen now trading fastest laps now that they all have low fuel and brand new nice tires.
It's really a game of chicken. I mean, who's going to pit first? And then when you do pit, can you bring down a fast lap on your out lap while the other person's on their in lap or in the process of going through the pits?
It would have been interesting to see either Hamilton or Alonso stay out longer. Now, Alonso was clearly waiting on Hamilton. Hamilton was waiting on nobody because Hamilton had built up the time. So had Hamilton pit and Alonso stayed out, would Max have pit then? Probably not. He probably would have stayed out and kept racing, and who knows where that would have taken us, but it did happen in that order. Lap 48, Fernando comes on and says he would like to stop lifting and coasting because he, quote, wants to win the race.
I did have a note about that. So right before that at lap 46, at this point, I was kind of caught off guard. So we had Alonso pushing as hard as he could. We're on lap 46, and Alonso is 4.3 seconds behind Max Verstappen. Perez was not able to pass the Ferraris. So you tell me what is happening to this Red Bull dominance? Where is it going? And it isn't until 48 where that gap starts to really open up, but then we see why, because we see that Alonso has been told to lift and coast. So I'm wondering what he could have done if he had just been able to stay out or to stay full throttle and not have to do that whole lifting and coasting process.
So this is where we get the vague message from the team that they were concerned about fuel and braking and tires. So I think the team thought, hey, if we stay where we're at, we're going to finish second. Let's not risk blowing a tire. Let's not risk running out of fuel. Let's not risk our brakes overheating and catching on fire. Let's just get second.
I get it. It's just a loser's mentality.
If they had their other driver in the top 6 or 7, maybe
fair.
one of them could push. But with your
That's
other
fair.
driver not in the top 10 at the time, you've got to get points because you are in a dead heat battle with Mercedes for the constructors' second place. Lap 52, I just made a note on the standings. Lap 52, you have Verstappen, Alonso, Hamilton, Leclerc, Sainz, Perez, Albon, and Russell. And you made a note on the Red Bull dominance. You know, where is it going? I don't really think it's going anywhere. I think Verstappen could win by more if he wanted to. Perez, we know, can't really work his way up the pack when he qualies low. So him to get up into 5th or 6th was fine, I think. Lap 54, this is where George Russell has to call it a day. He had a valiant effort going in extra, however many laps after he just slammed on that wall and broke his tire. But they said that the brake wear was far too high on the car. So he has to retire. So 2 retirements in the race. I'm skipping ahead to lap 61. So about a 5-6 lap jump. Hamilton is 1.5 to 2 seconds on Alonso. Verstappen has an 8-second lead. So this is where Verstappen starts to stretch it out a little bit.
Fernando Alonso's engineer comes on the radio, says Hamilton 1.9 behind. Fernando's reply, copy, leave it to me. What a gangster reply. I have never heard anything. I got chills when he said that. I got chills all the way down my arm. I got chills when I watched the race the second time.
That's on the level or maybe slightly better than the um, all good to go hunting, or free to go
Yeah.
hunting. Just awesome.
Copy. Leave it to me.
It sounds like they're like fighter pilots that are about to go into a dogfight with somebody.
So cool.
Okay, lap 63. I just took a note on some of the folks in the top 10. Alex Albon holding seventh. I was blown away by his performance.
Yeah.
Valtteri Bottas in ninth. I love seeing Valtteri get points. Again, he could be a dominant driver at a Red Bull or Mercedes or whatever. He's hanging around at Alfa Romeo. And Lando Norris in 10th. And you're thinking, is McLaren going to get some points? Maybe, but there's still 6 laps left for them to blow this. And keep in mind, he's got a 5-second penalty. Lap 64, there's a battle for ninth. This is where Norris is trying to make up his 5-second penalty to get up into the top 10. Because even though he's in, 10th, 9th, 8th, whatever, he's technically not in the top 10 if you don't have 5 seconds on everybody behind you. He does pass Valtteri Bottas at the hairpin. They go wheel to wheel at that last chicane down the DRS zone, and Norris comes out ahead, but Valtteri was making him work for it quite a bit.
Yeah, and this is the exact same time that we see Max go flying over a curb, to which he quickly comes on the radio and goes, almost knocked myself out. It's like, hey, man, what is this, a joke to you?
I noted that when they noted on the broadcast, which is about 2 laps later, so I had it incorrectly labeled. But yeah, they were showing the replay, and he's having fun just driving a $50 million car around, leading a race, and like, I almost hit that wall, guys. What's crazy?
That's crazy.
And I think that's why he was so surprised to see that Fernando had hit that wall in the cooldown room, because he's like, did you hit that wall? Lap 67, Lance Stroll locks up at the hairpin, goes wide. He's currently in 11th. I was like, oh, there goes any chance for him to have a successful finish. This is also where Norris is playing the FIA game on the radio. Man, Ocon's got a real loose rear wing. Somebody should look at that.
If that comes off, it could really hurt somebody.
Yeah, it could go in the stands. Who knows where it could end? Norris tries for an inside pass at the hairpin, but he can't do it. The problem with that hairpin is it's got a big curb on it, and it's got that grass area. You really can't get speed if you cut that apex, because it's way too big of an apex. So you kind of have to back out of it if you don't get the position before the turn really starts. Okay. That's it.
Oh, come on, man. We got to end it better than that. Talk about this Alpine and McLaren race between Lando Norris and Esteban Ocon. This race was crazy between those two at the last couple laps.
So it was, but it was diminished by how the race ended, because I think at that point, I at least had forgotten about Lando Norris's penalty.
I know.
And I was like, man, so Lando was in 9th at the time, I believe.
Yeah.
Fighting for Ocon, who was in 8th. And they were going wheel to wheel, swerving all over the track, trying to get up. And Norris ends up getting slid off the track.
God, yeah, he was trying to go on the outside corner or hold the outside line, and I think he got pushed wide.
That runoff area right before the pit entry, where it's just kind of like some big open concrete, and they've got that little sign directing them back onto the track.
Yeah, and he had to go off and then re-enter on the runoff area.
So to his credit, he was really trying to get points, and the race finishes, and it shows Esteban Ocon 8th, Lando Norris 9th, Lance Stroll 10, so on. And you're like, oh, okay, he did it. But
then that's when they took it away.
But then it edits itself, and he drops down to 13th because the penalty.
I will say, right as we did see that whole thing happen with the Lando Norris and Alpine kind of racing there at the end, where he had to go wide and hop off the track, at that moment, we kind of all just took a big sigh of like well, there went that race. There went that chance. And then out of nowhere, the announcer comes on and goes, and Lance Stroll goes to the inside of Bottas and he'll get the position. I was like, whoa, let's go.
I had ruled Lance at, like I said, when he missed that, when he locked up at the hairpin, I was like, that's his race. But he fought back and made it worthwhile. He would have been in 10th.
Well, yeah, he would have been in 10th if it wasn't for Lando Norris's penalty, and Bottas would have been in
11th.
But thankfully, Lance will pick up 2 points, and Valtteri will take one home.
Verstappen wins by 9.3, maybe 9.6 is the
Should
final.
have been
9.5
less.
is the final. Could have been less. It could have also been more. It depends on how much he was really pushing it throughout the race. Red Bull gets its 100th win in Formula One, which I'll be
Yeah.
honest, if I had to bet, I would have said that they got that already.
It felt, I don't know if it's just us diminishing it, but it felt like they probably should have had that back when Sebastian Vettel. But the thing we're not taking into
Yeah.
consideration is just how new of a team they are. It's not like they have the history of McLaren or Ferrari. They're fresh.
No, and they're running more races by far than they ever have. So like if in my head I was thinking back to the Vettel years where they had 4 years of dominance, and I'm thinking, oh, they're running 20 races a year and they're winning 10 to 15 of those, and it just the math doesn't work that way apparently.
Yeah, it also, it's hard too because you got to remember that Mercedes had years of just dominance, and it was either one Mercedes or the other Mercedes, whether that was Lewis and Nico or Lewis and Bottas. It didn't matter. There was just constant wins for Mercedes, and Red Bull had Sebastian Vettel. Now, granted, at the time, Mark Webber was pretty dang good and giving it his best, but it wasn't like it was Sebastian Vettel and Max Verstappen. You know what I mean?
So Ferrari ends up holding on to fourth and fifth. Their strategy worked once for Ferrari. Yay, a strategy worked out. I think that was the only way for them to get fourth and fifth from their starting positions was to do that one stop and no stop during the safety car. So yeah, your race finishes and you go Max Verstappen, Alonso, Hamilton, Leclerc, Sainz, Perez, Albon, Ocon, Stroll, and Bottas. Again, I mean, I'm not a big Williams fan or anything, but I do like the back marker teams being successful every once in a while, and especially Alex Albon, who we've seen pace out of. That's pretty nice. Piastri does technically finish ahead of Lando Norris in 11th, whereas Norris is 13th. Again, kind of a technicality thing, but we're seeing improvement from Piastri. And then kind of looking down at the bottom of the table, obviously the two retirements of Russell and Sargent, and then ahead of that, Nick DeVries in 18th. I really thought we'd be seeing more out of him this year. Maybe that's just the AlphaTauri car stinking, but we've also seen Yuki do some amazing things in that AlphaTauri car. Kevin Magnussen goes 17th, disappointing day. Zhou Guanyu goes 16th. Actually, not a bad day for Zhou Guanyu. He worked his way up a couple places. Nico Hulkenberg, 15. Wah, wah.
That's what I was talking about, though, is they have this great qualifying, but there's no race pace. And if there is race pace, it almost seems like there's always something that takes them out of the fight.
So looking at the go ahead.
I was just going to say one last note on that 100 wins for Red Bull. Do you know how many of those are from Max Verstappen?
Oh, they said it too.
He has
40 something.
41 of the 100 race wins for Red Bull.
Again, we talked about this maybe last race. Do they win every race this year? I'm still going to play the odds and say no, just because there's going to be some race where Sergio doesn't qualify well and Max retires or whatever, but they definitely have a chance.
It's not looking good for the rest of the teams if anybody else wants to get a win, or if, what is it, mission 33 for Fernando Alonso?
Yeah. Looking at the kind of the wrap of the race, we'll roll through this quick. They interview Max, obviously, as the winner. He just said that he was comfortable the entire time. He thought it was a good race, but he was comfortable. Alonso mentioned that he really wanted to challenge Red Bull, but he was happy with the battle that he had with Hamilton. I think he's just happy that Aston Martin has a competitive car, and he made a good career decision going to Aston Martin when he did. And then I made the note that it's kind of weird to see Lewis get interviewed because it just hasn't happened a lot in recent memory, but it's nice. He still has, I think, more fans than anybody. Like the crowd
easily.
The crowd erupts when that guy starts talking, and it's because he's the champion, but he's also probably more likable than Max and Fernando.
Well, there was during the practice sessions for this weekend. Well, also he's very successful at Canada, but the practice sessions, one of them, the majority of the ending of it kind of got rained out, or perhaps no, I think it might have been the one where there was a red flag because they couldn't get the CCTV cameras to get synced up again, and so they kind of had to get rid of like 30 minutes of the practice session. Regardless, though, Lewis Hamilton is seen out of the car and he's walking up towards the track waving, and the entire crowd that's there for that practice session is just erupting for him. I was like, this man is loved in Canada.
Yep. Just like when you see him and George at the British Grand Prix, like they go crazy. So looking at the cool down room, as Jeremiah likes to make sure I have the correct vernacular, Hamilton walks in and asks Max if his car was bumping around a lot, and Max is like, I guess. And then Hamilton's like, it's the bumpiest track I've ever driven on. Like definitively saying, no, Max, this is a bumpy track.
That might just be a testament to Red Bull's figuring it out with that car.
This is something you don't see in a lot of sports. You don't see football coaches laying out their game plan after a game, right? They might say, oh, we try to run the ball more, we try to pass. I loved hearing this from Hamilton, and I don't know if his team would want him to express this, but he said, we suck in low-speed corners.
He's honest.
And I guess everybody can watch the footage and see that, but you're just blatantly telling your opponents where your disadvantage is.
Well, it's not like saying we have a 5 millimeter gap between our left wing and it's nothing like that.
No, everybody saw that in Monaco when they lifted up the Mercedes and the Red Bull over the crowd. They saw that 5 millimeter gap.
I think everybody saw the difference in really how complex the Red Bull looks underneath compared to the Mercedes. It kind of looks basic.
And then finally, Alonso walks in the room, and that's about the chance where they all sit down, and it shows the clip of Alonso back on like lap 4 or 5, slapping into that wall, and Max looks at him. You hit the wall? Just so surprised that Fernando Alonso would hit a wall.
Hey, it's bumpy out there.
So, I mean, looking ahead, just real quick, where are we standings wise? Obviously, Max is still far and away the points leader, with Sergio Perez actually still in second, Alonso third, Hamilton fourth. There could be a battle for second. I think there will be. Sergio hasn't been top of his game, recent memory. And Mercedes still holds on to second in the constructors, but only by 13 points. So
we'll see.
You're talking one weekend.
This is what happens when Fernando Alonso finishes higher than Lewis Hamilton. Lance Stroll figures out how to get some points, and George Russell eats it.
It would have been really nice for Aston Martin for Lance Stroll to have a top 6 finish, top 5 finish, which he's capable of. We just haven't seen it.
He is.
And it also would have really helped Mercedes' cause to have George finish, 5th or so.
I think it's safe to say for now that Alpine's going to go ahead and run away from McLaren unless they make some drastic changes. Alpine's sitting with 44 points, McLaren 17. And with McLaren not scoring again, and even with the option of him scoring, he was in 9th before the penalty. So that would have been 2 points. They got to make up 30. I don't know. I see Alpine locking in that 5th spot. But what's weird is that it's always been kind of like there's the top 3 drivers, and then the number 4 spot is the best of the rest. But the best of the rest is considered Ferrari, and Ferrari is considered one of the top. I don't know. It's weird. It's like there's 4 top teams right now and not 3 like there's been in previous years. So the best of the rest would really be Alpine in 5th.
There's 4 teams. There's one team that can win, and that's Red Bull. And I think that's actually the difference here. And then there's 3 teams that are podium worthy, which is going to be Mercedes, Aston Martin, and Ferrari. In previous years, I mean, we saw it with Mercedes, I guess, but the run Red Bull's going on is incredible right now. What they're doing,
they're
on
almost
track,
double Mercedes in second.
Right. So again, take them out of the picture, and it does look like a regular year, right? With
True.
Alpine being 4th at that point. I will say, wouldn't you be ticked to be Alpine right now, and you think coming into the season, oh, we're going to be fighting for 4th, maybe if Ferrari stinks we can be 3rd, and then Aston Martin, who's been 7th or 8th every year, is just great.
Just comes out of nowhere.
I guess we'll see it unplay or fold out on Drive to Survive, but I'm really interested to hear kind of the Alpine's management just racking their brain as to what Aston Martin did to make that happen, because they also want to do that.
I guess when Christian Horner was like, change your car, Aston Martin was like, that's not a bad idea. We should scrap everything.
Is that when Toto Wolff got the idea to change their car? Christian Horner yelling at him. Okay, I think that's all we've got for the 2023 Canada Grand Prix. Jeremiah, anything else?
No, man, that was just a great race. I'm happy to see Aston Martin fighting for second, possibly even first. And I'm excited to see where this goes as developments and upgrades get brought. Maybe they bring the fight to Red Bull. Who knows?
Awesome. All right. If you have any comments or thoughts on the race, leave us a comment. Let us know. Other than that, we'll see you.
Bye, guys.